Okay, so these are the data. As I told you, now the time framework is that of the 7, because Chile in a way anticipated other countries and it started to implement some liberalization reforms related to financial markets in particular in the second half of the 70s. The initial, let's say, 4 years represent the expansionary phase of the cycle, because as you can see, Chile recorded quite a relevant growth rate of GDP, of the economy, with the growth rates higher or close to 8%, which is remarkable. In particular, what you can see there is an incredible surge in capital inflows. Sense from 1977 to the following 4 years, the capital account surplus almost doubled. I mean, doubled, more than doubled, tripled from 1977 to 1978, and then it remained at very high level. A capital account surplus in the order of 12% of the GDP is a considerable amount. I mean, Chile received a huge amount of capitals with respect to the size of the economy. And what happened? There is a connection between the capital account and the current account because, again, the trade balance was more or less close to the equilibrium, not in equilibrium, but quite close, and then it worsened significantly. And this happened also for the current account. The difference between the trade account and the capital account are those terms we discussed yesterday when explaining the national accounting of an open economy, are the net interest payments and the mainly net interest payments, not remittances here. But the fact that the current account was significantly worse than the trade account is due to the fact that Chile got considerably indebted on international financial markets, and then it had to start to repay the external debt, and therefore there were at the time negative net interest payments. In any case, it's kind of clear that from a time sequence, the surplus and the capital account came first, and then worsening of the current account and trade account followed. Initially, as we can see, there was an accumulation of foreign reserves, as expected, according to the 5 steps we discussed yesterday, 5 steps in the balance of payment cycle. So the central banks of Chile started to accumulate reserves, and this was related to the attempt of progressively stabilizing the nominal exchange rate. If you can take the line exchange rate variation, you can see that more or less similar to what happened in Mexico at the beginning of the 90s, the exchange rate variation decreased. So the attempt was to introduce step by step a fixed exchange rate regime. Not from the very beginning, but reducing year after year the variation in the nominal exchange rate, right? So it was a gradual introduction of a fixed exchange rate regime. At the time in Latin America, there were the so-called tablitas. The tablitas were a hybrid exchange rate regime in which domestic governments, national governments, anticipated the expectation of economic actors, but declaring the targeted, better to say, variation in the exchange rate. It was a kind of communication between the domestic monetary authorities and domestic actors saying, this year we will allow the exchange rate to depreciate by this amount, guiding in order to provide a sort of guidance to economic actors in order to accompany their expectation and move gradually towards the introduction of a fixed exchange rate regime. And in fact, as you can see, in 1881, there was no depreciation at all or variation at all in the nominal exchange rate, right? As you can see, the nominal exchange rate is a component of the real exchange rate. What happened was, again, similar to what happened in Mexico, is an appreciation of the real exchange rate. If you take the real exchange rate, As you can see, starting 100, which is the base year, 1977 is the base year, is our terms of comparison. The real exchange rate progressively declined. This index number progressively declined, representing an appreciation of the real exchange rate. Everything changed in 1882. In 1882, as you can see, there was a massive reduction in the amount of capitals entering the Chilean economy. We moved from almost 10 percentage points less, because we were 13.8 in 1881. Capital inflows declined down to 4.2 in 1882. Capital inflows were not enough to compensate for the large current account and trade deficit. There was a massive loss in foreign reserves. It was impossible for the Chilean central bank to defend the exchange rate parity. And in fact, as you can see, if you then check for exchange rate variation, you can clearly see that there is a new depreciation of the exchange rate, quite strongly, in the sense that in 1882 the exchange rate depreciated by 30.5%. This caused, in developing countries, more time, an exchange rate crisis brings with it a financial crisis, because if you are indebted on international financial markets, most of the time you are indebted in foreign currency, you're indebted in dollars, and therefore if the domestic currency depreciates and your revenues are in domestic currency, it means that the burden of the external debt gets higher, higher, and higher, and in the end you won't be able to repay the external debt. So therefore, many economic actors, non-financial, but in particular financial firms, will go bankruptcy because they will be unable to support and sustain, because they will be unable to meet interest payments denominated in foreign currency after there is such a devaluation of the domestic currency with respect to the foreign one. And in fact, as you can clearly see, in 1882, there is a massive collapse of the Chilean economy, an enormous recession of minus 10%, right? Interestingly, even in the case of Chile, there's no sign at all of twin deficit, because even at the beginning of this cycle, the fiscal deficit was quite small, 1.1%. It could have been even accepted by European standards, if you like. So it is a relatively small deficit. But in any case, in the 3 years anticipating the outbreak of the crisis, the fiscal balance was actually in surplus rather than deficit. This is pretty normal in the sense that in a booming economy, it could be expected that the fiscal balance improves. This means that there were no signs of unsustainable fiscal expenditures. And this applies also in the wake of the crisis, in the sense that for a developing country, scoring a minus 1% fiscal deficit with respect to GDP, and in the context of a massive recession where there is a reduction of the GDP minus 10%, it means that actually Chile, even in the wake of this crisis, implemented tough austerity measures, as most of the time suggested by international organizations, even though this will imply basically killing the economy, because, as you know, you badly need counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies, in particular during recession. So recession are the periods in which fiscal expansions are mostly needed. In this case, this is not the case. Developing countries have the severe problem of running most of the time pro-cyclical policies, in the sense implementing austerity measure during crisis. And this is what happened in Chile, basically, because again, taking into account that the domestic economy declined by minus 10%, still the fiscal balance was almost in equilibrium with a very modest deficit. And the contraction was very relevant. As you can see, 1983, already the trade balance was positive because there was such a huge decline in domestic GDP, not compensated at all by any fiscal expansion, led to a dramatic drop in imports and therefore restoring the trade balance. This is in line with what the IMF actually suggests to many developing countries to do when hit by an external debt crisis. You need to squeeze your economy or these policies have tough consequences on everyday life and on the the state of the economy in general, right? So I think that I would like to spot this case because I think there are strong similarities with respect to what we discussed yesterday in the case of Mexico, and I think it is a kind of important stressing similarities between these two examples and giving you an idea of a prototype balance of payment cycle, right? Hope it is clear enough. You can check by yourself what happened in South Korea in 1997, 1998, at the eve of the East Asian crisis. You will see that more or less dynamics are broadly similar. The magnitudes of the data are obviously different, even because the South Korean economy at the time was already much larger than Mexico and Chile. But still, the connection between magnitudes, between variables, and the evolution of the cycle are more or less the same. 2 points which are worth stressing here. One is that with respect to what generally claimed by the supporters of the twin deficit hypothesis, the nexus of causality seems to run the other way around. Yesterday we said supporters of the twin deficit in general claim that the fiscal deficit leads to the current account deficit, and then the current account deficit causes financial account surpluses, so massive external indebtedness, in the end not sustainable. Here it seems the other way around. The financial surpluses comes first, so a huge amount of capitals entering the economic system comes first. This will lead to a boom of the economic system. That boom of the economic system will be accompanied by current accounts deficit, and in the end this boom will reveal itself as unsustainable. But the initial push comes from surpluses in the financial account or capital account, call it as you prefer. And that's why the nexus of causality seems the other way around. Financial account surpluses, huge increases, huge surges in capital inflows give an unsustainable boost to the economy, leading to current account deficit. In these cases, there are no signs of twin deficit or fiscal imbalances as primary sources of macroeconomic external imbalances. These are the 2 points I would like to stress. This doesn't mean that the public sector doesn't play any role in previous external crises. It may happen that in some cases, domestic governments adopted an unsustainable fiscal stance. I'm not saying that public sector is never responsible for that. What I'm claiming is that it is not true what neoliberal economists are used to claim, that the public sector is always the primary responsible for that. It could be well the case that dynamics in the private sector are the original sources of disequilibria and imbalances, leading the economy to a crisis. Right? Is it clear to everybody? Okay, so we could move on, and we could move to the next step. Yeah, there are the additional tables you can go through. We considered already Mexico yesterday. Korea is something you can analyze by yourself. Now, I want to move a little bit closer to our times because I would like to consider what happened at the beginning of the 2000s. Why? Because the picture, the macroeconomic picture, is a little bit different with respect to what described before the 90s. Why? Because first of all, at the beginning of the 2000s, apparently there was not a problem of current account deficit. Why? Because many countries benefited of the prices, at least temporarily, of primary commodities. Okay? Before the outbreak of the subprime crisis, but even after, at least until 2013, prices of primary commodities were very high. If you remember, around 2013, there was a price of a barrel of oil was far above $100 per barrel. So it was about $130, $140 per barrel. And obviously, for countries mainly exporting primary commodities, high price of primary commodities could help to avoid current account deficit. That's obvious. In terms of the macroeconomic regime, the experience of Chile, of Mexico, are experiences captured by previous tables, are experiences in which there was a gradual introduction of a fixed exchange rate regime. This was also the case of Argentina at the beginning of the 90s, when there was the introduction of the currency board, eventually abandoned in 2001. In the 2000s, most of an increasing amount of developing countries, Latin America among them, adopted a different monetary regime because they adopted a flexible nominal exchange rate regime. So they allowed their currencies to fluctuate with respect to other currencies. And monetary institution just focused on controlling inflation. In a way, the position adopted by monetary policy was this one. You don't need to care about the exchange rate. You just need to focus on targeting inflation. You need to focus on guiding the expectation of economic actors about future inflation. And in order to do so, you use your policy tool, which is the interest rate. You set the domestic interest rate at that level such that economic actors will have expectation about inflation consistent with your target. This is the meaning of inflation targeting. Inflation targeting basically means that you're looking at people's expectation about inflation. And to provide guidance to people's expectation, you move the interest rate in your home economy. And when you change the interest rate in your home economy, you basically don't care about consequences in terms of the nominal exchange rate. You try to give up any attempt of controlling the nominal exchange rate. And that's why you move from a fixed exchange rate regime to a flexible exchange rate regime. Because you want to pursue a pure inflation targeting monetary policy. Also because the experience of the 90s told us that in many cases, fixed exchange rate regimes were not sustainable and were exposed to financial crisis or to speculative attacks to the exchange rate. Keep also in mind what I told you yesterday, that if you look at the main aspects of the Washington Consensus policy package, there was not any clear indication of which type of exchange rate regime you should adopt. Okay, Milton Friedman himself was a supporter of a flexible exchange regime. So the fact that many Latin American countries adopted a fixed exchange rate regime or a quasi-fixed exchange rate regime in the 80s or the 90s, it is because this was perceived as a useful policy tool in order to fight against inflation. When it came out that exchange rate regime exposed developing countries to speculative attacks, then in the 2000s, policymakers changed in a way their mind and moved to a flexible exchange rate regime combined with a pure inflation targeting monetary policy. Obviously, things are much more complicated than with respect to what economic theory tells you. Because then if you plan to work in a central bank in any Latin American country, you will never find someone saying we adopt a pure inflation targeting monetary regime and we don't care the exchange rate. Because for many Latin American countries in which the so-called pass-through rule is very important. The pass-through is the effect of imported prices over domestic inflation. Controlling the exchange rate is in a way something important. It's not true that central banks in Latin American countries don't give attention at all to the exchange rate, because changes in the exchange rate may have an effect also on domestic inflation, because if there is a depreciation of the exchange rate, this could cause the price of imported goods to increase, in particular prices of imported intermediate inputs, and this could give a lift to domestic inflation as well. Okay. Therefore, in most of the cases, in real terms, in practical terms, central banks in Latin American countries try to find a compromise between a pure inflation targeting monetary policy and some attempts of controlling the exchange rate. Okay, because again, the exchange rate is a significant variable. It is a very important macroeconomic price, potentially affecting also domestic inflation. Right. This is, in any case, a different monetary policy regime with respect to what we had in the 90s. And in any case, this tells you that most of the time, Latin American central banks are more favorable to appreciation of the exchange rate rather than depreciation, because appreciation of the exchange rate tends to curb domestic inflation rather than increasing it. Okay, so in a way, we could talk about a kind of hybrid monetary policy regime in which you target inflation. You do not, the exchange rate is a secondary goal, if you want, it's not the primary goal. You don't limit yourself, you don't limit your monetary policy to the control of the exchange rate. The exchange rate is taken as a secondary goal, if you want. The secondary goal, however, must be consistent with the targeted inflation rate in the economy. And most of the time, domestic central banks are happier with an appreciation of the exchange rate rather than with a depreciation, because this led to a reduction in imported inflation. Right? Is it okay? Third point, well, the experience of Chile is quite telling in the sense that there was, in a way, an adoption of anti-cyclical monetary fiscal policies in periods of financial bonanza, and in particular in periods of high increases of primary commodities, in the sense that, for instance, the Chilean economy ran significantly fiscal surpluses when the prices of primary commodities, when the price of copper was very high at the beginning of the 2000s, in order to then intervene with more substantial fiscal expenditures in downturns, when there were declines in the price of primary commodities or during crises. So the adoption of anti-cyclical fiscal policies was an aspect to take into account at the beginning of 2000s. This suggestion coming from international institutions, in any case, about the overall functioning of the economic system, was that it is still important having a kind of flexible and regulated economy. Do not try to control the nominal and real exchange rate. The competitiveness, the international competitiveness of the economy should be ensured by the flexibility and the increase in labor productivity. Okay, so there should be structural factors guiding the real exchange rate. You should not control the real exchange rate by managing the nominal exchange rate, but the competitiveness of your economy should be ensured by the dynamics of labor productivity. Keeping domestic prices low and possibly in line with foreign prices, that should be the structural condition making your economic system competitive. Okay. These aspects are actually taken from a paper I wrote together with Antoine Godin and Marco Missaglia, and describing a little bit which was the Colombian environment at the beginning of the 2000s. This paper is among the reading list I sent you, and you should have received also the paper as well. So if you look at reports written by the OECD about Colombia, the OECD was very clear in the sense acknowledging there could be problems related to the increases in prices of primary commodities, that economy to an economic boom, to an unsustainable economic boom. But at the same time, the advice is coming from the OECD were very clear in saying you don't have to try to control the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate in particular. If you want to remain competitive, you have to ensure your competitiveness via structural reforms, which means flexible labor market, deregulated economy, and increases in labor productivity. Okay? Exactly. I mean, this is the reference to the Colombian case. What I tried to do in this paper is trying to model the Colombian case and possibly extend a bit this model, and do not restrict this model just to the to the case of Colombia, but trying to make it a little bit more general, trying to combine the balance of payment cycle we saw before in the data, and trying to see whether a balance of payment cycle could be triggered by temporary surges in the price of primary commodities. Temporary in a, let's say, in a kind of temporary surges in primary commodities. The discovery of large endowments of natural resources, or temporary increases, again, in the price of primary commodities. Typical example of primary commodity booms, which in the economic literature has been generally defined as Dutch disease. I'm trying to combining three pieces of the story, if you want. The Dutch disease, the possible connection between the Dutch disease and financial dynamics, and balance of payment cycles. Okay, so I'm trying to, and that's why in previous version of this model, in previous version of this paper, I use the term financial Dutch disease, because I take a surge in natural resources, in the price of natural resources, as the kickoff, at the starting point for this cycle, but then trying to see if these initial increase in the price of primary goods could be connected in a way to surges in capital inflows that could eventually give rise to the balance of payment cycles we analyzed theoretically and through the data in the previous part of the lecture. In these 5 points, I tried to describe more or less what was going on in Colombia at that time. There was a huge increase in natural resource-oriented FDI entering the Colombian economy. It was recognized there was a strong nominal and also real appreciation of the Colombian currency, of the real exchange rate. You could observe a kind of financial euphoria following the initial increase in the price of primary commodities, and it was recognized there was a case of deindustrialization taking place. And indeed, at that time, the Colombian government coined the term the locomotora minera, trying to identify in the mining sector, in the oil industry, the a leading sector boosting the Colombian economy. What I'm trying to do is to fit these stylized facts into a theoretical model with the introduction by using these assumptions. Okay? This is precisely what I tried to do, what I told you before. So trying to describe a complex Dutch disease plus financialization phenomenon, okay? I don't see the chat, so if there is any question, please interrupt me, raise your hands and make me question, right? So because perhaps I saw that someone may have typed in the chat, but I don't have full control of the chat. So if you want to make a question, don't be shy, interrupt me. Close parentheses. So these are the assumptions. this is the theoretical framework and the assumption. As to the theoretical framework, points 1 and 2 are pretty standards in this type of model. So we assume a small economy, not influencing international dynamics, adopting liberalization policies, so with the liberalized trade and capital account. Differently, with respect many models developed in the 90s, here I'm assuming a flexible exchange rate regime. So I'm not assuming any longer a fixed exchange rate regime. If you look at the chapter written by Lance Taylor I mentioned yesterday, I think it is chapter 7 of his book Reconstructing Macroeconomics, in which there was the example of a cycle in the country factor risk, in the spread term. The two variables used in that model, in that dynamics, were the country factor risk and the stock of foreign reserves. Okay, why? Because the assumption was a fixed nominal exchange rate, was a fixed exchange rate regime. Yeah, I'm departing from that assumption. I'm trying to change that model by trying to see what happens if the domestic monetary authorities adopt a pure inflation targeting monetary policy, and therefore the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate primarily, is not fixed any longer, but it is flexible. What happens in this context if there is huge increases in FDI entering the economic system and targeting natural resources, and if then they might be followed by portfolio investments, those volatile portfolio investments that we analyzed very quickly yesterday, right? It is a very simple model. I try to remain as simple as possible. The model is characterized by two dynamic equations. Okay, so in technical terms, these are differential equations, because these equations try to describe the dynamics of some relevant economic variables through time. So when you see variables with a dot here, these are time variation. So these are changes through time of these specific variables. And which are these specific variables? Here you have the nominal exchange rate. E is the nominal exchange rate. So E dot is the variation through time of the nominal exchange rate, right? The nominal exchange rate, in particular, is the quantity. If you refer this model to the case of Colombia, this E is defined as the quantity of Colombian pesos you can purchase on financial markets with $1, right? So if E is increasing, if E dot is positive and E increases through time, it means that you are observing a depreciation of the Colombian pesos with respect to the dollar. Because with $1, you can buy more Colombian pesos than before. So E dot positive means that E is increasing through time, and means that you are observing a depreciation of the Colombian pesos with respect to the dollar. The definition of E is the quantity of Colombian pesos you can purchase, you can buy with $1. Right? If, on the contrary, E dot is negative, it means that you are observing an appreciation of the Colombian pesos. You need less Colombian pesos in order to buy a dollar, or alternatively, you could purchase less Colombian pesos with just $1, and it means that the Colombian pesos is gaining value with respect to the dollar. Right? This was an equation which didn't exist in the Taylor model, because in the Taylor model, as I told you, the assumption was a fixed exchange rate regime, which was a credible assumption in the 90s. It was not credible any longer in the 2000s, when many developing countries moved to a quasi-flexible, let's say, exchange rate regime, right? The factors explaining the evolution through time of the nominal exchange rate are the factors entering the balance of payment, because here you have imports and exports of manufactured goods. M stands for imports and exports of manufactured goods. All these values are denominated in dollars, right? So that's why here you have exports divided by the nominal exchange rate. This is the value of manufactured exports in Colombian pesos, then converted in dollars, right? Here you have the export of natural resources, because now we are talking about a small economy exporting a lot of natural resources. Natural resources in general are exported in dollars. That's why you don't see any exchange rate here applied. Exp stands just for exports of natural resources in dollars. Here you have payments on different debt. And again, here don't see any exchange rate used here because the different debt is assumed to be denominated in a foreign currency. So Colombia gets indebted in dollars. So you don't need to apply any exchange rate. You just get indebted in dollars. Here, PNR stands for the repatriation of parts of natural resource profits. Okay. One interesting point related to the Colombian case is that even though there were very high prices of natural resources, Colombia still recorded at the time current account deficit. How was it possible? It was possible because you received a lot of foreign direct investments, targeting domestic natural resources, increasing exports of oil, but at the same time repatriating part of their profits home. And that's why if you repatriate part of the profits home, you have a highly negative net interest payments. We are not talking about interest in the stricter terms of the sense, but if you want, let's call it negative net factor payments. Part of the profits are repatriated. So in this case, why there is a plus sign here? Just try to explain a little bit the sign, which might be important. Here there is a minus sign. Why? Because if you have a domestic company, don't care about the ownership, selling natural resources on international markets and being paid in dollars, and then you exchange those dollars in terms of domestic pesos, obviously this gives rise to an excessive supply of dollars and an excess demand of Colombian pesos. So this will lead to an appreciation of the Colombian pesos versus the dollar. But if part of those revenues are repatriated, okay, this term is kind of reducing the appreciation forces related to the export of natural resources, right? Repayments of previous debts will lead, again, to a depreciation of the domestic currency because you need to purchase dollars and sell Colombian pesos in order then being able to repay the external debt, okay? Differently from Taylor's model, here you have a variation in foreign reserves. Variation in foreign reserves is now a policy variable. Before, it was a consequence of the decision of the central bank of controlling the nominal exchange rate. Her dot now stands as the accumulation of foreign reserves pursued by the domestic monetary authority, say the Colombian central bank. The more foreign reserves you pile up, a positive R dot will imply a depreciation of the domestic currency, because the domestic central monetary authority will demand dollars and sell domestic pesos in order to pile up foreign reserves. Alternatively, when you sell dollars, you decline the amount of foreign reserves. So if R dot gets negative, it means that the domestic central bank is selling dollars and purchasing the domestic currency either to defend the exchange rate or because it wants to lead to an appreciation of the domestic currency. Okay. The final two components are the capital account related to portfolio investments and the capital account related to FDI. The idea that FDI are booming in order to target the domestic natural resources. Okay, the initial boom in FDI, then potentially leading to a boom in portfolio investments. The amount of portfolio investments entering the economic system depends on the uncovered interest we considered in the yesterday. A slightly different uncovered interest parity. Why? Because here there is the home interest rate. Here there is the foreign interest rate. Here there is the country factor risk. No difference at all with respect to what we saw yesterday. What is missing here is the expected depreciation of the exchange rate. Why? Because now I'm assuming that capitals enters the economic system by being denominated in dollars. So if foreign lenders give you money in their own currency, in dollars, you do not suffer any risk of capital loss in the exchange rate. It is like US banks are giving loans to Colombian banks denominated in dollar, right? So in this case, the exchange rate risk we considered yesterday simply disappear, right? This is a very important point. The exchange rate risk disappear in the explicit form, it reappears in a more implicit form because the effect of the nominal exchange rate is here in the country factor risk. The country factor risk is influenced by these two variables. One is the nominal exchange rate, and the other one is the level of external debt. D is the level of external debt. Why? Because the country factor risk is positively influenced by the nominal exchange rate. Why? Because the more depreciated is the nominal exchange rate, the heavier is the burden of foreign debt on the shoulder of domestic borrowers. So if the exchange rate depreciates, it becomes harder, as we saw before, for domestic borrowers to repay foreign debt. And therefore, the country factor risk obviously tends to increase. And the same applies to the stock itself of foreign debt. If the stock of foreign debt D is higher, it means that domestic borrowers are burdened with a higher stock of debt, and it will become harder for them to meet interest payments. So the likelihood of a default on foreign debt gets higher. Does it make sense to everybody? Okay. The other term through which I would like to describe the dynamics of the economic system is the evolution of the external debt, which is related to portfolio inflows, to the balance of portfolio inflows, which is related precisely to the equation I described before. Okay. If there are net capital inflows, net positive capital inflows related to portfolio investments, the stock of foreign debt will increase. If there is a reduction in negative capital account in terms of portfolio inflows, it means that the stock of foreign debt will decline. Right? Now, if you want, let's go through the paper. Now, I don't want to waste time, but in technical terms, in order to describe the dynamics in what is labeled a phase diagram, you have to take into account partial derivatives of those two equations close to the so-called steady state. The steady state is considering the condition in which there are no variation in our leading variables, okay? And we get this Jacobian matrix. Now, I don't want to bother you with the details of this. I want to move to the graphical representation of the dynamics, which I think it is more important. Here it's dynamics, okay? These are the so-called isoclines. The so-called isoclines are the condition under which the nominal exchange rate doesn't change. I'm not saying that the nominal exchange rate is fixed. I'm saying the nominal exchange rate doesn't change because we are in a flexible exchange rate regime. Okay, these are the combination. This isocline, this downward sloping isocline, is the combination of values of E, the nominal exchange rate, and D, such that the nominal exchange rate doesn't change. Okay, doesn't change through time. In the same vein, this other line is the isocline according to which D dot doesn't change. The stock of external debt doesn't change through time. Again, it's the combination of the nominal exchange of values of the nominal exchange rate and the external debt such that there is not any movement in the stock of external debt. if you go back to the previous equation, let me go back to the previous equation, it is like saying, if you plug in some specific values of E and D, this equation will be equal to 0. No change through time of the stock of external debt. In the same vein, if you plug some specific values of E and D in the first equation, there will be no change in the nominal exchange rate through time, right? But what you can see here is precisely a kind of cycle we experienced, we saw in the data. Let's assume the economy starts from point C. In this point, you have a phase in which there is an appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. E is decreasing. Okay, so the Colombian pesos are getting values, are becoming appreciated with respect to dollars. And also there are capitals entering the economic system because D increases. So it means that the Colombian economy, say, is becoming more indebted on international financial markets. There are net positive portfolio inflows entering the economic system, either because domestic borrowers are getting more indebted, but also because foreign lenders are willing to provide more loans, more credit to domestic borrowers, domestic Colombian borrowers. So in a way, this is the typical expansionary phase of the cycle. This is the typical expansionary phase of the cycle in the sense that capitals are entering the economic system and the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate, is appreciating. In this model, I don't explicitly take into account the dynamics of prices. Okay, so in a way, the appreciation of the real exchange rate is given by the appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. Right? What happens here? Now the cycle starts to revert because capital are still entering the economic system, but you start to observe a depreciation of the nominal exchange rate. So the Colombian peso starts to depreciate with respect to the dollar. Why? Because the booming phase of the economy is leading to a worsening trade and current account deficit. So there is an increasing mismatch between imports of foreign goods and exports of domestic goods. The trade account and the current account start to worsen. Capital inflows are not enough to compensate for a worsening current account, and then pressures for a depreciation of the exchange rate start to emerge inside the economic system. If you remember what we discussed yesterday, if the nominal exchange rate starts to depreciate, then foreign lenders start to become a little bit more scary about the sustainability of the external debt and this economy. And this is the phase in which there is a collapse. The exchange rate depreciates and capitals revert their direction. Capitals revert their direction because there is the so-called, year before it was a kind of a sort of sudden stop. And here is the capital reversal, when expectation about the sustainability of external debt from the point of view of foreign lenders abruptly changes. Foreign lenders start to ask their money back, and therefore there is a strong reduction in the stock of foreign debt simply because foreign lenders close the credit lines previously provided to this economy. Right? Does it make sense, dynamics, to you? More importantly, can you somehow match what I'm telling you today with respect to what we said yesterday? This kind of modeling what we discussed yesterday, right? And of course, this cycle, now again, I don't want to enter into the details, if it is stable, will converge back to the equilibrium point A. What is relevant is that how can we include the Dutch disease, the temporary surges in natural resources, in this model? In this very simple way. If we assume that there is a huge increase in FDI targeting domestic natural resources, the huge increase in FDI entering the economic system will basically displace this condition, this equilibrium condition. You will see a move of this isocline far to the right. this isooctane for a stable value of the nominal exchange rate will move to the right. Because if you go back to previous equation, what will change is this term. This term will cause a radical change in the, let's say, evolution of this country. It will create permanent no, but at least some pressures for the appreciation of the exchange rate, okay? So it means that we will have a structurally different condition of E and D in order to maintain the nominal exchange rate fixed. From a graphical point of view, it means that this isocline is displaced far to the right. A was the previous equilibrium point, B becomes the new one. Okay? And here there are two very important dynamics. There is the cyclical dynamics we described before. Okay? A doesn't represent any longer the equilibrium, so a cyclical dynamics is set in motion. And also you see the gap between A and B. These 2 points are associated to different levels of the nominal exchange rate. You get the cyclical dynamics in order to converge towards the new equilibrium point with the expansionary phase of the cycle, the sudden stop, and then the capital reversal, and the cyclical evolution of the exchange rate. But also, when moving from point A to point B, you will see that the nominal exchange rate will be permanently more appreciated than before in the long run. So this is precisely, if you want, first of all, the medium run macroeconomic outcome of this temporary resource boom with financialization. FDI first, targeting natural resources. This will cause pressure for the appreciation of the exchange rate. And portfolio capital inflows will come, and trying to exploit the appreciation of the exchange rate because it becomes more convenient for domestic borrowers to get indebted in foreign currency, and at the same time, at least temporarily, it becomes more in the eyes of foreign creditors, the foreign debt, the Colombian foreign debt, let's say this way, becomes more sustainable. So no problem in providing Colombia with more credit, because insofar as the nominal exchange rate appreciates, there are no problems in terms of sustainability of the external debt, right? This is the sample. The problem is that these evolution dynamics is highly unstable in the sense that there is the expansionary phase of the story, but then if the nominal exchange rate becomes too much appreciated, if the real exchange rate is not competitive any longer, if you start to accumulate considerable current account deficit on top of this, because the repatriation of part of the revenues from natural resources, then the exchange rate will start to depreciate and perspective of investors will radically change. The burden of foreign debt could become at least partially unsustainable, and then the reverse part of the cycle. Right? This figure was an early attempt to describe the more structural consequences of this temporary resource boom with financialization, financialization episode. These parts are all connected to each other, and I will try to explain it with some details. First of all, here on the top left of this figure, you have the so-called isocline combining value of the nominal exchange rate and the capital account related to portfolio investments, such that along each of these lines you have constant values. You have constant values of the manufacturing share in the domestic economy. So in this figure, I'm trying to capture the effects of those macro dynamics might have on the structure of the economy. Why I'm trying to do so? Because most of the time when talking about financial instability in developing countries, we focus just on pure macroeconomic variables. I'm trying to extend a little bit my horizon in order to see if these cyclical dynamics may have also an effect on the productive structure of those economies. And therefore, I'm trying to guess which might be the implication in terms of the productive structure. the productive structure here is very is captured in a very simplistic way by the share of domestic manufacturing over domestic GDP. This is M. Okay. M A, if you want, is the structural composition of the economy, the sectoral composition of the economy, captured by the share of manufacturing over domestic GDP, corresponding to the original equilibrium A. If you go back in the previous figure, there was the old equilibrium point and the new A was the original equilibrium point. MA stands for the share of domestic manufacturing corresponding to the original equilibrium. Okay? The fact that this isocline is positively sloped is related to the fact that in many cases, when there are booming portfolio inflows entering the economic system, these portfolio inflows tend to increase sector different than manufacturing. Most of the time, they target either the financial sector itself or the real estate. So in many cases, not always, however, in many cases, when there are booming portfolio inflows entering the economic system expands. But in relative terms, manufacturing expands less than other sectors in the economy. Okay, and therefore there might be a reduction in the share of manufacturing over the economy as a whole. If you want to keep constant the share of manufacturing in the economy, you need to depreciate the nominal exchange rate, because this depreciation will boost the competitiveness of domestic manufacturing, might give rise to more export of manufactured goods, or better to say, if you want to compensate the potential loss in terms of manufacturing share over the domestic economy, a depreciation of the exchange rate might be needed, because it could give some leeway to domestic manufacturing in terms of international competitiveness. And that's why the isocline is upward slope. Okay? What I'm trying to say is that, which is the interpretation of the left-hand side of this figure, is that when there is the natural resource boom, it happens that since that there are the economy moves towards a higher exploitation of the mining sector, and therefore the mining sector is expanding in relative terms with respect to manufacturing, in any case, you would need a depreciation of the exchange rate. If you want to compensate the effects of the natural resource boom over the productive structure of this economy, you would need, regardless portfolio investments, a depreciation of the exchange rate. Okay? Even the more so if you have cyclical dynamics. If you have cyclical dynamics in which the exchange rate first appreciates and then depreciates, creating problems of exchange rate volatility and instability, in general, this is very negative for investment in the manufacturing sector, because investments in manufacturing are most of the time irreversible investments. Entrepreneurs investing in manufacturing would like to have a sort of stable macroeconomic environment. The more unstable is the macroeconomic environment, the less will be investments. Okay, so not only the appreciation of the nominal exchange rate, but also the instability of the exchange rate in general, it's negatively investment in manufacturing and the relative expansion of manufacturing. So that's why I have MA1, MA2. These are the needed depreciation of the nominal exchange rate in order to compensate for natural resources, okay, which by themselves will move the economy far away from manufacturing, and the instability produced by the cyclical dynamics described in the previous figure. What happened, unfortunately, in the economy we considered before, is that we move from equilibrium A to equilibrium B through the cyclical dynamics we saw before. So in the end, in equilibrium B, the share of manufacturing will be definitively lower than what we had before. MB, the structural composition of the economy will move in a perverse direction, in the sense that that economy will experience a premature deindustrialization. The share of manufacturing will tend to decline with respect to what was observed in the original equilibrium A. Right? It is clear more or less. In the right-hand side of this figure, I'm trying to gauge the effects of this process of premature deindustrialization. There is a nice paper written by Daniel Roderick trying to capture the idea of premature deindustrialization and showing how, with the exception of Asian countries, Latin American economies and also African economies, with the exception of Mauritius, experienced premature deindustrialization in the 90s and the 2000s. This is trying to capture in a formal model this effect. Here, on the upper part of the right-hand side of the figure, I'm trying to capture again the positive relationship between a depreciated nominal exchange rate, which might increase via the real exchange rate the competitiveness of domestic manufacturing, and the share of domestic manufacturing in the economic system. If you depreciate the nominal exchange rate, you depreciate the real exchange rate, you give more competitiveness to domestic manufacturing, and therefore the manufacturing sector could expand in relative terms with the rest of the economy. Okay. The natural resource boom caused two effects in this case. The natural resource boom, together with financialization or booming portfolio inflows, caused two effects. First of all, this curve moved to the left. Ceteris paribus, even taking into account a given exchange rate, but if you do not take into account the cyclical dynamics and the secular appreciation of the exchange rate, we will have a lower share of domestic manufacturing in the economic system because there is the direct expansion of the natural resource sector, because most foreign investments will, targeting domestic natural resources, will boom the oil sector will boom the mining sector with respect to the other industrial industries, right? On top of this, we will not remain at the original level of the nominal exchange rate, but there will be the appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. So on top of the left-right movement of this figure, we will move along the new line from this point to the lower one, because as we saw in the previous figure, here, the permanent reduction in the nominal exchange rate and the permanent appreciation of the real exchange rate. In the end, you can match this part with the left part of this figure, the right part of this figure, because the share of manufacturing in the domestic economy will decline again from MA to MB, right? Which are the effects in terms of dynamics of labor productivity? This is the growth rate of labor productivity. If we trust, I don't know if you already heard about that, the Kaldor-Verdun rule, the idea that the share of manufacturing is important in order to boost the dynamics of labor productivity, we could have a permanent reduction in the growth rate of labor productivity. This is labeled the Kaldor-Verdun rule because it was Kaldor, one of the economists in this, attaching a specific role to manufacturing as a relevant source of labor productivity dynamics. If manufacturing declines, and in particular if manufacturing declines in relative terms with respect to other sectors, then you might see a negative, a reduction in the growth rate of labor productivity. With all the consequences, the reduction in the growth rate of labor productivity may cause in terms of overall dynamics of the economy. This is, we are moving towards the end of the lecture. So these are the policy advices coming from the ECD and specifically related to the case of Colombia in the first 10 years of the 2000s. The OECD was recognizing that there was a problem of natural resource boom. It recognized that there was a problem of appreciating real exchange rate. What I told you before is that, okay, even though there is a problem of potential deindustrialization taking place, of appreciation of the nominal and real exchange rate, you don't need to try to control the exchange rate through monetary policy. Better if you keep the competitiveness of your economic system going through public investments, which could increase the TFP and maintain the real exchange rate competitive. So don't try to adjust the nominal exchange rate, try to work on domestic prices. Reduction in labor cost was clearly stated in the OECD country report at that time. You have to eliminate the minimum wage standards, deregulate the labor market. Perhaps if you want to invest in the economy, invest via public investment such that infrastructure improves and the TFP increases. Through increases in productivity, then you could maintain the real exchange rate viable. Okay? It might be important to diversify the economy, but try to diversify, so in a way to move away from the natural resource sector, but try to modify, to diversify the economy through horizontal industrial policy. So do not try to intervene in terms of distortionary industrial policies, okay? Provide the economy with more needed inputs, increase capital accumulation, improve the education system such that more technological knowledge could be absorbed by the economy, but don't try to pick up the winner. Don't try to pick up specific sectors different with respect to the whole sector and through a kind of standard industrial policies implemented during the period of import substitution. The IMF, the OECD was well accepting counter-cyclical policies in the sense that if those countries adopt a kind of restrictive fiscal policy in times of boom, these were well received in the sense that could even help to reduce the domestic expansion and try to control perhaps problems in terms of the real exchange rate related to prices, which are not considered here. The policy advices I include in this paper are different because they come from a kind of heterodox, point of view. And this is the idea of, let's discuss this, and perhaps then we could have more time during the tutorial time to deepen this analysis. This is what happens if I introduce capital controls. And if I try to remove the link between the dynamics of the exchange rate and portfolio investments. Okay, if we move back to the previous equations, what I'm saying is that if we introduce capital controls, I'm eliminating this connection. Okay, I'm eliminating this condition. So the inflow of portfolio investments is not linked any longer to the appreciation or depreciation of the exchange rate. Okay. A possible example of capital control is that if you get indebted in foreign currency, okay, then that currency will be fixed in the sense that if you get a loan, a foreign loan, if a Colombian bank gets indebted with a US bank receiving $10,000, okay, and the exchange rate is 1-to-1, make it simpler, you cannot exploit in the future an expected appreciation of the Colombian pesos. You will have to repay that debt 1-to-1 because there is an exogenous tax levied by the domestic government. Okay, so this will reduce the incentive for domestic borrowers to get indebted in foreign currency when there is an appreciation of the domestic exchange rate. And at the same time, this will have an influence on this first equation, on the dynamics of the nominal exchange rate as linked to the dynamics of exports and the dynamics of the financial account related to, in particular, to portfolio investments. What will happen is that the D dot will become a vertical straight line because it will not be influenced any longer by the nominal exchange rate. Okay, if the nominal exchange rate doesn't play a role in explaining the evolution of foreign debt, it means that here we have a vertical straight line. And secondly, the E dot curve, which was previously negatively sloped, very likely becomes positively sloped. Okay, because E will have a self-stabilizing effect on its own variation. Okay, what happens? What happens is that, first of all, if there is a natural resource boom, the E dot line will move downwards in this case. Okay, you might still have the appreciation of the secular appreciation of the nominal exchange rate from A to point B, but you don't see any longer the cyclical dynamics we saw before. So outside the equilibrium, you will converge straight to the equilibrium, and the instability, financial instability associated, possibly initially kicked off by the natural resource boom, will disappear. Okay, so at the very least, you remove the problem of the cyclical dynamics of the instability and the volatility in the exchange rate, and therefore in the macroeconomic environment. At least you will remove that problem. Then you need to compensate for the appreciation of the exchange rate, the secular appreciation of the exchange rate from point A to point B. Okay, which is the traditional Dutch disease problem. And these are the policies, these are the additional policies I'm suggesting in order to avoid the permanent appreciation of the exchange rate in presence of a natural resource boom of the Dutch disease. I want to stop here because I think it could make sense to discuss together these policy implications during the tutorial time. And even because I spoke barely for 1 hour and 30 minutes, so probably you are close to kill yourself, and I hope that I will quit as soon as possible. So I want to stop here. We could return on these in the tutorial time. I had in mind to make another presentation in the sense that to extend a little bit further this analysis, because more recently I wrote another paper in which I tried to more explicitly take into account the possible change in the productive structure of developing countries as a consequence of temporary financial booms, linked or not to natural resources. And this was the second presentation I would like to take into account. I don't think we will have time enough to go through it. Let's see if there is chance to add 1 more hour. I mean, it depends on you. Perhaps you don't like it, and that's it. But first of all, let me stop the sharing of the screen. Okay. In the tutorial time, perhaps we could spend some more time discussing these policies according to your views, according to ideas you might have in terms of policies needed in order to avoid the permanent appreciation of the exchange rate reported in the final table. And okay, so questions, ideas, as Mario Cimoli was used to say when I was a student of the summer school, angustias. Any angustias?
Hi Alberto, I have just one angustia, so simply adapt. Maybe I lost some part of your explanation, but when you were explaining the OECD guidelines, you were talking about the reducing labor costs with elimination of minimum wage in developing countries. How could it help to reduce a minimum wage in like industrialized countries, not industrialized, like less developed countries that need to boost the industrialization maybe and to help the labor forces? It's not an anti-cyclical measure to...
No, I mean, I completely against this policy advice coming from the ECD, but the claim was that if you have a regulated labor market, then the labor force will have more strength in the bargaining process with there are 2 ways basically. The trade unions will have a stronger bargaining power with respect to the employers. So they will be able to obtain higher real wages. Higher real wages will have a negative effect on manufacturing via 2 ways. by reducing profitability, so entrepreneurs will invest less, and also by probably leading to an increase in domestic prices. Even though domestic prices will increase, even though increases in domestic prices will not be able to compensate entirely for the higher wages, because real wages will be higher, in any case, the increase in prices via a kind of cost push, higher cost of labor will imply higher prices, will impinge and will reduce the international competitiveness of Colombian manufactured goods. So that is the suggestion coming from the ECD. You have to make the labor market as deregulated as possible in order to make the economy more competitive. Well, this is the idea of internal devaluation applied so extensively in many European countries in the wake of the financial crisis, when there was some economists claimed, okay, many European countries have a problem of external competitiveness, since that you can't move any longer the nominal exchange rate because you are part of the monetary union. You have to devaluate. You have to introduce a kind of internal devaluation, reduce domestic wages in order to reduce the labor cost and regain competitiveness on international good markets. This is the line of reasoning, applying also to the case of Colombia. If you introduce a minimum wage policy, in a way, the implicit consequence is that you increase the bargaining power of trade unions. And this is not what you want if you want to be hypothetically more competitive, right? Gabriel, am I right? So please give me support. Can you confirm what I'm saying? I'm not saying bullshit, right?
Well, I'm waiting for a financing from the IMF, so no, I totally agree. This is a key message that we are trying also to give in classes. And also, I would like to recall a discussion that we have with the students about the importance of industrial policy and the rigidities that are associated with inertia in technical change and the pattern of specialization in Latin America. We have insisted a lot in this idea that indeed flexibilization of the markets, and in particular of the labor market, is a non-starter for encouraging structural change in this country. So we are perfectly on the same page.
I mean, just to clarify, this doesn't mean that you can do with wages whatever you want. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you make wages increase like hell. It means that very likely the increases in wages should be in a way associated to the dynamics of labor productivity. That's why labor productivity is important. And on top of this, the more effective is the industrial policy you implement in your country and increase the quality of goods produced and potentially exported, the more you can afford, as an economy as a whole, experiencing increasing in real wages. Okay, so you might have wages increasing faster than labor productivity if then the price elasticity of your exports become less relevant. This is in general what is said about German export, for instance. The higher is the quality of your goods, the less your goods are, your exports are elastic to price, and therefore you could even afford yourself to increase wages and give a boost also to the domestic economy, because in any case your export won't suffer and your imports won't increase massively. So again, the factors influencing the idea is I'm against the obsession about labor market flexibilization, okay, and deregulating the labor market. It doesn't mean that you can do on the labor market whatever you want. What you do in the labor market, the kind of distributive policy you implement your own country should be consistent with the industrial policy implemented and with the dynamics of labor productivity. This is very important. Obviously, one problem of, I think, heterodox economics and the policy advices coming from heterodox economists is that they are much more complicated than the traditional suggestion coming from mainstream economists, because most of them will tell you, well, deregulate the labor market and that's it. Most of the game is done. Whilst you can clearly understand that the policy advice in which you say, okay, you could do with the labor market something consistent with what you do in terms of industrial policy, with what you do in terms of labor productivity, if you recognize the many complementarities that exist among different policies, the picture, the type of policy you have to implement becomes much more complicated. And policymakers and politicians most of the time want to hear clear, simple messages to be implemented, whilst the reality is much more complicated.
Thank you for your answer, Alberto and Gabriel. Thank you very much.
Gabriel, you're mute.
When you were speaking, I recalled this, I remember this work by Nastepat, I think that it was published in the Cyclical Change and Economic Dynamics, in which he argues that indeed non-price competitiveness was much more important than price competitiveness in the success of the German exports in the world markets.
Yep.
So I know that there are many questions surely to be asked, and I don't want to be the spoiler or the the person who ends the party, but I think probably in the afternoon it would be possible to continue the discussion.